Hello everyone, it's Elizabeth Stewart with the Symphony Guild of Charlotte, and in this next tutorial I'm going to show you a few simple stitches to create your Symphony Guild 2020 ornament. I'm going to show you how to prepare your thread for stitching. Embroidery floss is made up of 6 strands of thread. We are only going to be using 2 strands throughout the design, so we're going to be pulling out 2 strands at a time to work with. I like to strip my floss, and what that means is I pull out each strand individually. I'm going to pull out one, smooth my floss, pull out a second strand, and smooth my floss. It can get knotted if you don't smooth it out in between pulls. And then I'm going to straighten out the 2 strands that I'm going to work with and tie a nice secure knot at the bottom. If you're an accomplished embroiderer or you're comfortable doing a waist knot, this would be a perfect time to do that. You could also cast on with a few simple seating stitches if you wanted as well. Now that I have secured my knot, I'm going to go ahead and trim the tail of that knot to about 1/4 of an inch and thread up the other end of this thread on my needle. Now let's move forward with the split stitch veins. I am going to show you the split stitch. This is actually with green floss. You would prepare your thread just the way that I showed you earlier in the first segment. You'll come up on your design line. This is a straight stitch that you'll make first. And then with your second stitch, you'll take your needle up through the stitch that you just made, splitting those fibers. And then you're going to do another straight stitch on the design line. And you're going to keep working your straight stitches, overlapping them. So I make a stitch, then I come up with my needle in the middle of that stitch. I advance forward, complete that stitch, and then I'm going to come up in the middle again on my design line, splitting the fibers I have just laid. And I'm going to make one full stitch there. You can vary the width of your stitches, or I should say the length of your stitches, and that will give a different effect. The more closely you work your stitches together, the more textured your stem stitch will look. If you space them further apart, it'll be a much more smooth effect. So play around with the length and see which ones you prefer to do. I'm just going to speed this up a little bit now that you're getting the hang of this stitch. The split stitch is excellent to use on any sort of design. You can do it on a curved design, straight design, really anywhere you want to put it. It's a nice textured line, and I think it's a good accent here on this brush. You can also use it on the additional green sections. If you want to split stitch this entire design, you most certainly could. So if you don't think that you want to learn the closed fly stitch or the satin stitch or anything like that, you can go ahead and use the split stitch on any of the elements in this design, whatever you're most comfortable with. Continuing on with the brush element, we're going to do a straight stitch on the little brush leaves. That is going to also be in 2 threads of green floss, and it's just a simple straight stitch. So you'll come out on the end of the leaf and then bring your needle in close to the stem that you just created, and that is a very simple quick stitch, and you'll work that all the way up on both sides of the brush. It gives a nice texture to this particular brush, I think. And it's a quick stitch and easy to do. You could do the leaves in a different shade of green. Your kit comes with both a dark green and a light green, and you can play around with the combination and stitch it whichever way that you would like. I'm going to go ahead and speed up the camera here. You can see my stitch taking shape. I'm going to work up and down every single length of brush here, just covering my green design line the best that I can. And you'll see this works up quite quickly. And just a few more stitches here on this brush, and this will be complete, and then we'll move on to the next element. Now we're going to move on to the stem stitch. I'm also using 2 threads of green. This I'm going to do in the darker green, just like I did the brush. And the stem stitch is used in a variety of different applications. This is a modification of a crewel stem stitch, and what you're going to do is take one straight stitch along your design line, but you're going to come up, before you pull that loop tight, you're going to come up with your needle in between that stitch. And you're going to now pull that tight, make another stitch, leaving a loop, and then you're going to bring your needle up inside that loop on the design line and pull your thread through. Advance forward, making another loop, come up with your needle, and then pull your thread tight. I'm going to work this all the way down along the curve, and I'm going to focus my stitches along the inside of that curve, and then I'm going to come back and do a second row of stem stitch along the outer edge, and that will give me full coverage on my design line. The stem stitch is a great stitch to use when you're doing curve shapes, and it also has a nice rope-like appearance. Once you get the hang of it, it moves quite quickly. No, it doesn't take any longer than a split stitch or a back stitch, and it gives a really nice textured appearance. I'm going to go ahead and pick up the speed on this camera, and you'll see the stitch taking shape. I'm completing my first row of stem stitch, and then I'm going to come up almost to the top of the line again and work a second row of stem stitch down the outer edge. I'm going to do the same thing on the smaller side, on the right hand side, and this one is not necessarily going to need two rows of stem stitch, but of course you could do that if you wanted it to be a little bit thicker. And once you've finished the arms of this branch, go ahead and do just a simple long straight stitch across the body here. You could outline this if you wanted in a back stitch and do it as a true satin stitch, but I think just a couple of long stitches across here will do the trick. You're looking for coverage across the green design line. So I'm just going to take about 5 to 6 stitches across here, and that will complete the base of this. So I've got the stem stitch on the branches, and I've got just a straight stitch across the center of that branch. Now I'm going to be doing a lazy daisy. I'm going to use 2 threads of green. I've stripped my floss and prepared it just like I showed you at the beginning of this tutorial. And a lazy daisy is a loop, and I'm going to bring my needle up on the design line, put it down back in very close to where I put it through the first time. I'm going to wrap a loop around my needle and then just couch down that thread. So keep watching as I do this, and you'll start to see how I make this stitch. So I am doing a loop. Here I am creating a loop and holding it with my non-dominant hand. I'm coming out on the tip of that leaf and couching down the loop that I've made. So you're going to create the loop, bring your needle up at the point of the leaf, making sure that it's inside your loop, and then taking a stitch across that loop to anchor it. So a lazy daisy is essentially just a loop, and you tack it down on the end, and that helps hold its shape. Using the length of the design line as a guide, work your lazy daisy stitches across these branches. It is a stitch that takes practice, so if you want to use it on a corner of this fabric or on some scrap fabric, I think that's a really good idea. Sometimes it can take a little practice to get the tension right. If you put your starting, when you're making the loop, if you can start it and put your needle in very close to each other, you get a more closed look to the loop at the base. And I think that can be very nice. But if you want it to be more of an open appearance and less of a true rounded teardrop shape, then you would space out where you're bringing your needle up and putting your needle in. But essentially, it's just a loop, and you're bringing your needle up and through that loop, and then tacking that loop down to secure it and hold it into place. So I'm going to speed this up, and you can watch me do the lazy daisy across the rest of this branch. It is a stitch that takes a little bit more time, but it has a nice open appearance to it, and it's worth taking the extra time to do a lazy daisy stitch. Now, if you don't want to learn the lazy daisy, you don't have to. You could back stitch or split stitch around this design line. As I mentioned earlier in the video, you can do a split stitch or back stitch around every single element in this ornament. So we're coming up on the end of these stitches, and some of them are a little bit larger, and I'm just taking a quick tacking stitch across the body of the stitches in order to help it hold its shape. That's not a traditional lazy daisy stitch, but that's the way that I do it, and you could consider adding that as well if you want your stitches to remain a little bit more open and covering the design line. Now we're going to move on to the French knot berries. I am using 2 strands of red thread, and I'm going to come up in the center of the dot. I'm going to pull my thread all the way through, bring my needle close to the fabric, wrap the thread 2 times around my needle, place my needle back into the fabric, and with my non-dominant hand, pull tension on that loop, and then go ahead and pull your thread all the way through. So once again, I will come up in the middle of the design dot, bring my needle close to the fabric, wrap my thread 2 times around the needle, place the needle back into the fabric, slide those loops down to the base of the fabric, and then pull the needle all the way through. That creates the French knot. This is a wonderful accent. Here we're using it for holly berries. You can use a French knot to add texture and a raised element anywhere really you're interested in it. Sometimes people will use a French knot at the end of a lazy daisy, but I think here they make really cute little berries on this holiday wreath. Now we're going to be doing the back stitch with 2 threads of red. I am coming up on the number 2 about 1/8 of an inch away from the end of the design line, and I'm going to be doing a simple straight stitch. I am then going to be advancing my needle and coming back through the fabric in the hole, the very first hole that I made. So the back stitch is just a simple straight stitch, but you are sharing holes with the stitch that you previously made. So the stitch itself does not overlap, but you are sharing holes. When you are using the back stitch, it is important to try and do a shorter stitch length on a curve that will help you navigate the shape a little bit better. And on a straighter line, you can lengthen your stitch if you want. And playing around with the length of your back stitch will change the dynamic and texture of your stitch itself. I try to keep my stitch around 1/8 of an inch as much as I can. Sometimes you have to take a cheater stitch to fit in the line, as you see at the bottom of that too. I'm just going to work around. I've sped up the video here, as you can see. We're going to work our way all the way around these numbers, and I'm just making a simple stitch and sharing holes. I'm advancing forward and then taking a step back, and that's where you get the name back stitch. It's advancing forward and taking one step back. Now we're going to move on to the closed fly stitch. I'm using 2 strands of green thread. This time I'm going to be using a lighter green shade. You can play around with the shades whether you want to use your light green or dark green. But basically what I'm going to do is come up on my center design line and do one single back stitch. So I've made my first loop. The closed fly stitch is a series of loops. Coming up on the left side of your design line, going in on the right side of your design line, leaving a loop, coming up on your center design line, pulling the thread tight, and then tacking down that loop. So that completes one stitch. I'm coming up on the left, pulling my thread, going down on the right, and leaving a loop. I'm going to bring my needle up in the middle on the center design line, and then I'm going to pull that tight so my loop becomes snug next to the stitch I've previously made. And then I'm just going to tack down that loop that I just made. So the closed fly stitch is, as you can see, just a series of loops. We're making a loop, we're tacking the loop down. Now the key here is to try and make your stitches as close together as possible. The closer you work your stitches together, the more solid your fill will be on this leaf. The closed fly stitch is used very frequently for a fill stitch on a leaf because it does create a spine down the center. The tacking stitch, that's the last piece of this stitch, creates a small vein along the center. So it's perfect for a leaf like this holly leaf that we're doing here. And the closer that you work your stitches together, the more solid your design fill will be and the more raised your edge will be. So I'm just going to keep working my stitches, coming up on the left, going down on the right, leaving my loop, and bringing my needle up the center of the design line, pulling that loop tight, and then tacking down with a couching stitch to secure the loop. And we're going to work this all the way across the edge of this shape. And just, you'll see, you've got a V shape forming, and that will work its way all the way down, and you'll come to a point at the very end, and you'll have a completed leaf. So here I've got to anchor off this thread and start another one. I'm going to go ahead and speed up the video a little bit, and you can watch this stitch taking shape. I am working my stitches as closely together as possible. As you can see, I'm getting good coverage. My fabric is not showing underneath. However, you could have a completely different look if you wanted to space these stitches out. And if you did want to have fabric showing underneath, that would give a different look and it would be perfectly acceptable. This is your embroidery design, so you should make it however you'd like. I'm going to continue this off, and then we're going to move on to the next element. Now we're going to finish the piece. So at this point, you should have completed all of your stitches. Take your 4-inch hoop that was included in your design and separate the inner hoop from the outer hoop. The inner hoop goes underneath the fabric and the outer hoop goes on top. Make sure that you work your design so that it is centered evenly in the hoop. Just work it with your hands until you like the placement. Then start tightening the screw at the top. As you tighten, take time to smooth out the fabric and make sure that it's nice and firm inside the loop. You don't want any bunching or gathers on the outside rim of this design. So keep tightening the screw until you're happy with it. You want the fabric to be drum tight. Now what we're going to do is a basting stitch, a simple running stitch along the circle that you see printed on your fabric. I am going to go ahead and tie a knot in 2 strands of thread. You could also use 3 strands of thread if you're interested in that. And what we're going to do is just go ahead and do a rough basting stitch along this outer circle that you see printed here. And as you work your stitch, you can keep pulling, and if you have a big enough knot, you should have enough tension, and you'll just keep pulling those stitches tighter and tighter and tighter, and the fabric will all move towards the back of the piece. And I'll show you how to tuck in your fabric and really make it nice and neat on the back. So I'm just working my stitch all the way around. This stitch is going to help us gather the fabric in the back, so it does not need to be perfect. Try to keep your stitches about 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 of an inch in length. And as you can see, as my circle goes around, I'm pulling up on the slack, and that is starting to gather the fabric towards the back of the piece. So I've just continued my stitching all the way around the circle, and I'm going to start gathering up both ends of that string that I just wove through. And as I gather up this string, I am tucking in that extra fabric so that there's a smooth edge on the outside. I'm going to tie a knot and just secure everything, make sure that it's nice and tight, and that's the back of it there. And then there you can see the front all finished and ready for the ribbon. Now I'm just going to take my ribbon and thread it through underneath the screw there in the center, and I'm going to tie a knot. Depending on your application where you want to actually hang your ribbon and your ornament, you might need a larger loop or a smaller loop, but you've got plenty of ribbon there to play around with. I'm going to put this on my tree, so I don't need too much of a loop. I'm going to trim off the extra ribbon that I have there, and my ornament is complete and ready to hang. Well, this will complete the 2020 Symphony Guild of Charlotte Holiday Ornament. I hope you enjoyed these stitches and enjoyed making the project.